The night I found out who he really was, I was standing in his kitchen in a borrowed shirt, making coffee at 2 in the morning, completely in love with a man whose last name I was about to learn was the same as the family that had destroyed mine. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. Not the dramatic version, the real one. The coffee maker was gurgling. His apartment smelled like cedar and something warm I had never been able to name. I had been seeing him for 4 months. I had told my best friend 3 days earlier that I thought he might be the one. And then I saw the mail on the counter. My name is Vivian, and what I'm about to tell you is the story of the most complicated love of my life, and the secret that was buried so deep in both our families that neither of us knew we were standing on top of it. His name was James. I met him at a gallery opening in SoHo on a Thursday evening in October. I was there because my friend Maya had dragged me out of the apartment where I had been spending too many evenings alone since my last relationship ended. He was there because, as he told me later, he had walked past the gallery, seen the lights, and gone in on impulse. He was standing in front of a painting I loved, a large canvas, all navy and gold, abstracted to the point where you couldn't be sure what you were looking at, but felt certain it mattered. He was looking at it the way people look at things that have caught them off guard. I stood next to him and said, "It looks like a memory that isn't quite yours." He turned and looked at me. Then he looked back at the painting. He said, "That's exactly what it looks like." We talked for 2 hours. We left the gallery together and found a wine bar around the corner and talked for 2 more. He was 34. He worked in private equity. He said this in the slightly apologetic way that people in finance sometimes do when they are self-aware enough to know how it sounds. I was 31. I worked in art restoration, which he found genuinely fascinating in a way that didn't feel performed. He had a quality I have only encountered in a handful of people. He was completely present. He didn't check his phone. He didn't let his eyes drift to other corners of the room. When I spoke, he listened like the words mattered. I had forgotten what that felt like. We exchanged numbers. He texted that night, not immediately, not desperately, but at a time that suggested he had thought about it. We had dinner the following Tuesday. By the 3rd date, I was already in trouble. What I knew about him over those 4 months? His name was James Hargrove. He had grown up in Connecticut. His father was in finance, now retired. He had a younger sister named Claire, who he clearly adored. He had gone to Yale, then Wharton. He was meticulous about small things. His apartment was organized with a precision that was not sterile, but considered, like someone who believed that how you keep your space reflects how you keep your mind. He was kind to waitstaff. He remembered everything I told him. He had a scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident at age 7 that he touched when he was thinking hard. What I did not know? His father's full name, his mother's maiden name, the specific architecture of the family wealth that had funded his education and his early career, and the apartment in Tribeca where I now stood at 2 in the morning making coffee. The envelope on the counter was addressed to James Hargrove, but beneath his name, in smaller print, was a return address. Hargrove and Whitfield Capital Partners. The name Whitfield hit me like cold water. My mother's name, before she married my father, was Eleanor Whitfield. I stood very still. My mother's family, the Whitfields of Greenwich, Connecticut, had not spoken to her in 27 years. The estrangement was the central fact of my mother's emotional life, the wound around which everything else in our family was arranged. I had grown up knowing only fragments. There had been a falling out, something to do with money and my grandfather's will, and accusations that had never been fully explained to me because my mother could not speak about it without shutting down entirely. What I knew: my mother had been written out of her father's estate. Her share, which should have been substantial, had gone entirely to her brother, my Uncle Richard, who had managed the family's investment partnership, and who had used that position to, according to my mother, manipulate my grandfather in his final years. My mother had fought it. She had hired a lawyer. She had spent 3 years and most of her savings on a legal battle she ultimately lost. The experience had broken something in her that had never fully healed. She did not talk about the Whitfields. She did not attend her father's funeral. She had changed her name back to her maiden name after the divorce from my father, and then, in what I understood as an act of radical severance, had changed it again to her grandmother's name, Marsh, so that nothing of the Whitfield identity remained attached to her. I had grown up as Vivian Marsh. I had never known the Whitfields personally. I had known only the shape of the damage they had caused. And now I was standing in the kitchen of a man whose family's investment firm bore their name. The coffee finished brewing. I poured 2 cups by instinct. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I brought the cups to the bedroom. James was awake. He often woke in the middle of the night, a light sleeper with an active mind. He sat up when I came in and took the cup and said thank you, with the particular warmth he had when he was half asleep, which was one of the things I put the thought away. I said, "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Hargrove and Whitfield. Who is the Whitfield?" He looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in his face. Not alarm, but a kind of attention, a recalibration. He said, "My mother's family. Her father founded it with mine in 1987. Why?" I put my coffee cup down on the nightstand very carefully. "What was your grandfather's name?" I said. "Your mother's father." He said, "Edward Whitfield. He died about 15 years ago?" "Why, Vivian, what?" "My mother," I said, "is Eleanor Whitfield. Edward was her father." The silence that followed was the kind that rearranges things. You could feel the room reorganizing itself around the information. James sat very still with his coffee cup and looked at me, and I could see him doing the same math I had just done, arriving at the same place. "Your mother is Richard's sister," he said. "Richard is He married my aunt. He's been a partner in the firm for 30 years. We looked at each other across the bed. I said, "I didn't know." He said, "I didn't know either." And then we sat in the silence for a long time, because there was nothing else to say yet, and because sometimes you need to just let a truth sit in the room before you decide what to do with it. I want to tell you what I did not do in that moment, because I think it matters. I did not leave. I did not panic. I did not immediately construct a narrative about what this meant for us, for our 4 months, for everything I had been building in my chest since a Thursday evening in October. I sat with my coffee and I looked at the man I had been falling in love with, and I thought, this is the information. Now what do you do with it? The next 2 weeks were the hardest I had navigated in years. I told my mother. This was not a simple conversation. My mother is a woman who has survived a great deal through a combination of fierce practicality and absolute emotional containment. She processes pain by compartmentalizing it so thoroughly that it sometimes seems to disappear, until something touches the sealed compartment and you see, briefly, what's inside. I called her on a Saturday morning. I told her I had been seeing someone. I told her what I had found out. I waited. The silence on her end lasted so long I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "How serious is it?" I said, "I think it could be very serious." Another silence. She said, "What's he like?" And I told her, all of it. The gallery, the painting that looked like a memory that wasn't quite yours, the 2 hours and the wine bar, and the 4 months of him being exactly as present as he appeared to be. I told her about the cedar smell and the organized apartment and the way he touched his eyebrow scar when he was thinking. I told her that I had not once, in 4 months, caught him being a different person when he thought I wasn't looking. My mother listened. When I finished, she said, "And he didn't know." It was not a question. I said, "No." She said, "Has he spoken to Richard about it?" I said, "He called his mother. He hasn't spoken to Richard yet." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I need some time, Vivienne." I gave her time. James, meanwhile, was doing his own navigation. He told me about the conversations with his mother, a woman named Patricia, who apparently received the information about who I was with a silence very similar to my mother's. Patricia Hargrove had grown up knowing the shape of the Whitfield family estrangement from the other side. She had known Richard Whitfield for 30 years. She had her own position in this history that James was only now beginning to understand fully. We met for dinner 10 days after the night in the kitchen, a place we had been twice before, neutral ground, familiar. We sat across from each other, and it was, in certain ways, like meeting again. The information had changed the geometry of us, not broken it, changed it. He said, "I've been going through my father's records, things he kept from the partnership's early years." I looked at him. He said, "I think what happened to your mother wasn't what we were told." He put a folder on the table. I looked at it. He said, "My grandfather and your grandfather were equal partners when they founded the firm. Equal shares, equal say. When your grandfather died, his will was supposed to split his stake equally between your mother and Richard. Equal shares. That was his expressed wish, documented." I said, "She was written out." He said, "She was written out of a version of the will that my father's attorney helped Richard produce. There's a prior version. My father kept a copy. I don't know why. Maybe he knew. Maybe he was hedging against something. But it exists." I sat very still. "The original will," James said, "left your mother exactly what she should have had. What followed, and I want to be honest that this part is not romantic. It is not the part of the story that feels like a movie, was 14 months of legal work. James's attorney, my mother's attorney, re-engaged. Documents that had been filed and misfiled, and in one case stored in a box in James's father's Connecticut home office for 15 years, because nobody had looked for them and nobody had thought to ask. Richard Whitfield did not cooperate. He was not expected to. He denied. He litigated. He was, in the way of men who have built an identity around a theft they committed long enough ago to have half forgotten it, genuinely affronted by the suggestion that anything improper had occurred. But the documents existed, and once they existed in the right hands, they had a weight that denial could not balance. I will not tell you the final settlement number. It is my mother's to know, and I will tell you only that it was significant, and that it came with an acknowledgement, not an apology, not from Richard, who is constitutionally incapable of apology, but a legal acknowledgement in signed documents that Eleanor Whitfield Marsh's rights had been violated and were being remedied. My mother called me when it was done. She called at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday and said, "It's over." I said, "How do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Like I put something down that I've been carrying so long, I forgot I was carrying it." I said, "Good." She said, "Tell James thank you." This was, from my mother, a significant thing to say. James and I are still together. This is not the ending I would have invented because it sounds too convenient, too symmetrical. The forbidden love that turned out to be permitted. The family secret that resolved into justice. Real life is not usually this clean, but it happened this way. What I can tell you that is true and not symmetrical, it is complicated. My mother and Patricia Hargrove have spoken once, on the phone, a conversation that lasted 40 minutes and that my mother described afterward as not terrible. Richard Whitfield's name is not spoken in any room I share with James without a particular quality of loaded silence. The firm still bears the Whitfield name, which is a fact that my mother finds, depending on the day, either darkly funny or quietly enraging. James touches his eyebrow scar when he is thinking hard, and he has been thinking hard a great deal in the last 2 years. He is a man who takes seriously the idea of reckoning with the things your family has done. I think this is one of the reasons I love him, and I think it is one of the reasons the last 2 years have been both the most complicated and the most solid of my life. The painting from the gallery, the navy and gold one, he bought it for me. It hangs in the apartment now, in the living room, where I can see it from the kitchen. On the evenings when everything feels like too much, I look at it. It still looks like a memory that isn't quite yours. It is increasingly mine. If this story reached you, if you have ever loved someone and discovered that love was more complicated than you knew, I want you to hear this. Complication is not the same as wrongness. Some things that are true are also hard. You are allowed to hold both. There is a part of this story I have not told you yet. The part that happened before I called my mother, in the 12 hours between finding the name on the envelope and making that call. I went home that morning. James offered to let me stay, but I needed my own walls around me while I thought. I walked through SoHo in the early February light and felt the particular unreality of a city that continues being itself regardless of what is happening inside you. Taxis moved, someone was eating a bagel on a stoop, a delivery truck idled outside a restaurant. My life had just become significantly more complicated. My love life had just intersected with the most painful chapter of my family's history, in a way that felt either like a cosmic joke or a cosmic correction, and I could not yet tell which. I sat in my apartment for 4 hours and thought. I thought about what I knew of love, which at 31 was not an insignificant amount. I had been in love twice before James. Once at 23, a relationship that burned hot and fast and left residue. Once at 28, a quieter thing that simply ran out of fuel. I knew what it felt like when something was real and what it felt like when something was a story I was telling myself. James was real. The 4 months had been real. The listening was real. And crucially, this is the thing I kept returning to in those 4 hours on my couch with my coffee going cold. He had not known. He could not have known. The name Vivian Marsh meant nothing to anyone in the Whitfield or Hargrove world. My mother's erasure from that family was so complete that I had been invisible to it for my entire life. We had found each other genuinely. Whatever came next, that was true. I thought about my mother. I thought about what she had carried for 27 years. The lawsuit, the loss, the systematic way she had rebuilt herself around the absence of an inheritance that should have been hers. I thought about what it had cost her, and what it had cost me, indirectly, growing up with a woman who had parts of herself sealed away. And then I thought something that surprised me. I thought, James's father kept that document for 15 years. Not destroyed it, kept it. In a box in a home office in Connecticut. A copy of the original will, the one that proved what Richard had done, sitting in a banker's box with a label I would later learn read simply, Whitfield, original. People don't keep things they want to bury. They keep things they cannot quite make themselves destroy. I don't know what James's father knew or intended. He died of a stroke 4 years ago, before any of this surfaced, and James described him as a complicated man, someone who had built his career alongside a partner he knew was not entirely honest and had made his peace with that in the way that people make peace with the compromises that fund their lives. But he kept the document, and because he kept it, and because his son fell in love with the wrong girl in exactly the right way, it surfaced, 27 years later, in the hands of people who knew what to do with it. I don't know what to call that. Fate sounds too simple. Coincidence sounds too dismissive. It was something in between, the way the world sometimes, if you are paying attention and if you are honest, and if you stay in the room instead of leaving, corrects itself. My mother came to New York in the spring, 4 months after the settlement. She stayed for a week. She does this sometimes, comes to see me and lets the city work on her, the way cities work on people who need to feel anonymous for a few days. On the 4th day, she met James for dinner. Just the 3 of us, at a restaurant in the West Village that I chose because it was small and quiet, and the kind of place where a difficult evening can still be a good one. I watched them across the table for 2 hours. James was careful with her. Not careful the way you are careful with something fragile, but careful the way you are careful with someone who has earned the right to be approached thoughtfully. He asked her about her work. She does textile conservation now. She came to it late in her 50s, and she is very good at it. He asked specific questions. He listened the way he always listens. At some point during dinner, my mother said something that made him laugh, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and she smiled at the sound of it, not at him exactly, at the fact of it, that this existed. After dinner, on the street, she hugged him. Brief, but real. She and I walked for a while after he got into a cab. It was a warm May evening, and the streets were full of the particular energy of a city in early summer. She said, "He's a good man." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a block. Then she said, "Your grandfather would have liked him." I had never heard my mother speak of her father in the present tense of what might have been. In 27 years, he had existed in her stories only as the man who had failed to protect her, who had let himself be influenced, who had signed the wrong document at the end of his life. I did not say anything. I just held her arm and we walked. The painting is still in the living room. I have looked at it 1,000 times by now, and it still does something different each time. Sometimes it looks like grief, sometimes like possibility, sometimes like both at once. James and I talked recently about what we want the next years to look like. The conversation was practical and also not practical. It was the kind of conversation where you were talking about apartments and timelines, but you are really talking about whether you are building something you intend to keep. We are building something we intend to keep. The Whitfield name is still on the firm. Richard Whitfield is still in Connecticut, older and quieter, and the settlement did not transform him into someone different. My mother does not spend energy on him anymore. She has put down what she was carrying, and she does not pick it up just to look at it. There is one more thing I want to tell you. Last December, going through a box of things my mother had sent me, old photos, some letters, objects from my childhood, I found something at the bottom. A photograph I had never seen. Black and white, slightly faded. A man and a woman standing in front of a large house, squinting a little in summer light. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, Edward and Margaret, 1961. My grandparents. Before everything. My grandfather looked, in that photo, like a man who had not yet made the choices that would define his legacy. He looked like someone's father, someone's husband. Just a man in summer light, squinting and smiling. I put the photograph on my bookshelf, next to the painting on the opposite wall. Some stories are about the damage families do. Some stories are about what survives the damage anyway. Mine is both, and I have stopped trying to decide which it is more. James's eyebrow scar catches the light sometimes in the evening. I am still learning all the things that make him think hard. I expect I will be learning them for a long time. I want to tell you one more thing about the night at the gallery where this all began, something I have thought about many times since. When I said that the painting looked like a memory that isn't quite yours, I meant it as an observation about the canvas. Abstract, distanced, belonging to some emotional space that you recognize without being able to name it. I did not know, standing next to a stranger in SoHo on a Thursday evening, that I was also describing the thing I was about to walk into. A history that was partly mine, my blood, my mother's wound, my grandfather's will, but that I had never been close enough to touch. A memory of a family I had never known, carried at a distance, never fully mine. James and I have talked about that line many times. He has a theory about it, that we say things that are truer than we intend to, at moments when our instincts are more awake than our conscious minds. That the part of us which knows something is trying to surface before we have the language to understand what we know. I don't know if that's right, but I know that when I look at that painting now, it looks different than it did in October. It has accumulated meaning. The navy and gold have absorbed everything that came after. The envelope on the counter, the phone call to my mother, 14 months of legal work, a dinner in the West Village in May, a black and white photograph at the bottom of a box. It looks like my life now, not someone else's memory, mine. Some things take time to become yours. Some love has to pass through fire before it knows what it is. Some families spend decades broken, and then, through the particular alchemy of the right two people finding each other in the right gallery on the right Thursday evening, begin, slowly, imperfectly, without anyone quite planning it, to mend. I am not telling you that love fixes everything. It doesn't. I am telling you that love, the real kind, the kind that stays present and doesn't perform, and shows up in the middle of the night when you need coffee and doesn't look away when things get complicated, that kind changes the odds. It doesn't guarantee anything, but it changes what is possible. My mother has roses now. She planted them last spring in the small garden behind her house in New Jersey, a house she bought with part of the settlement, the first home she has owned that she chose entirely for herself. Red ones. Climbing. She sent me a photo in June. Just the roses, nothing else. No caption. I knew exactly what it meant. James and I went to see her in July. We sat in the garden in the evening, the three of us, and the roses were still blooming. Late. Stubbornly. The way good things sometimes persist past when you expect them. My mother poured wine. James told a story that made her laugh again, the surprised kind. I watched them and thought about the painting, and about memories that become yours, and about how much of what we inherit from our families is damage, and how much of it, quietly and without announcement, is the capacity to survive the damage and build something anyway. My grandfather is gone. Richard Whitfield is in Connecticut with his version of events. James's father is gone, and the banker's box is gone, and the document is now in a courthouse file that will outlast all of us. What remains? A garden in New Jersey, a painting in a Tribeca apartment, a man who touches his eyebrow scar when he thinks hard, a mother who put down what she was carrying, and me, here, telling you this story, which is the truest thing I know how to do with something real. Subscribe, because every story on this channel is real, it is raw, and it is worth every minute. Drop a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? And tell me, have you ever found out that love and history were more tangled than you knew? I read every single one.